Hello. So I'm here to introduce you to Paper 1, our rhetorical analysis. So again, our class is project to project based and we work from paper to paper, and this is our first major project. So you'll see that what I'm taking you through is the assignment sheet, which is under the Paper 1 folder in our course site. It is the first thing listed. And so this is where you'll find, and this is something you should continue to refer back to for what kind of requirements and what is expected of you in paper number 1. So up top, you'll notice that there are requirements. So for paper number 1, you need at least 1,200 words. Remember, that is a minimum. So if you hit, say, 800 words, you're substantially less than the minimum required at least word count. And so just think about how that goes into my grading. So at least hitting the minimum word count. MLA documentation. So you need a works cited page. You need to make sure you're doing in-text citations for anything that you quote or paraphrase directly from. Most of the time, your works cited page will just have the artifact that you pick, okay? But you also might read an article about the artifact or do some research on the background of the artifact or the director. And you'll want to make sure you include that on the works cited page. The grading, this is 20% of your final grade. And then look at our syllabus for the due dates. So your job for this paper is to perform a rhetorical analysis of an artifact. Okay, so an artifact could be a single essay, a speech, an advertisement, a documentary, something that stands on its own though. So I've had students in the past want to look at a speech inside a movie, and that rhetorical situation is much too complicated and much too difficult to deal with in this paper, because you have to both deal with what's happening internally in the movie and then what the movie is saying about society. And so your job, again, an artifact could be a speech. So maybe it's a speech given by a politician. Maybe it's an advertisement, a popular advertisement. Maybe it is a documentary that you watch. All of those things are okay. A movie or a TV show or a speech inside a movie or a TV show, those don't quite fit the mold for what's an artifact here and what would be good choices for a rhetorical situation or for a rhetorical analysis. So your job for this essay is to analyze the rhetorical appeals made in your artifact. So your job for this paper is to make an argument about how rhetoric is working in the text in question. So we're thinking about how an author conveys ethos, what kind of logical arguments are being used, so what kind of evidence and how the artifact is structured and how those things make a difference in terms of audience and context and situation. Are there visual elements to your artifact that are operating rhetorically? Are there appeals to pathos or emotions at work? And so those are the rhetorical appeals. So ethos, pathos, and logos are the major rhetorical appeals that most texts will work through. And there'll be another separate video on those. Your job is to measure those against the rhetorical situation. So the rhetorical situation, and again, there'll be another video on this as well, and some readings on that. The rhetorical situation is defined as each individual rhetorical situation. So it's the context of a piece of rhetoric. So it'd be the context of your artifact has the following elements: a text, so the instance or the piece of communication, right? What kind of communication it is? Is it a speech? Is it an ad? the author. So who is that person? An audience. So even though, say for instance, an ad has a general quote unquote audience, you might decide that the target audience is maybe it's a Super Bowl ad, but it's an ad that uses a lot of pathos and emotion, and you might decide that this company is really trying to pull women in, that even though the Super Bowl has an audience of millions of people, but the ad is targeting a certain female audience. So what's the purpose? Why is the author putting together that piece of rhetoric? And then the setting, the time, the place, the environment, the history, the context of a piece of communication. So all of those things, the rhetorical situation conditions the way, or should condition the way, the rhetorical appeals are used. So for example, a president who is unpopular would have to do a lot more to craft their ethos in a speech, so their credibility, than say if they're trying to get a piece of legislation passed and get the public on board with it, right? And so that is where the rhetorical situation, the context of a piece of rhetoric really heightens that. So your job, and if we go down to specifics, this is what needs to be in your paper, right? So a thesis statement that clearly articulates your argument about how you evaluate the rhetorical appeals operating with and against the rhetorical situation. So that's your big point, is how are the rhetorical appeals being used to capitalize on the rhetorical situation? An overview of the rhetorical situation. So you'll need to research this, and you'll need to have a separate section in your paper detailing the elements of the rhetorical situation that are useful to your rhetorical analysis. And this is the basis for your evaluation. So say for instance, you're looking at a speech by Hitler, right? What is the rhetorical situation? There's so much history and context and politics and, cultural significance there that you'll need to do the research to see what that entails in order to understand and make arguments about how he's using ethos, pathos, and logos to get his point across, right? Because obviously, without understanding who the audience is, which is part of the rhetorical situation, you have little to stand on when you're talking about how, or when you're making claims about how the author is using, say for instance, pathos to really connect to their audience. Does that make sense? So the next step is you'll write sections. Now, a lot of students will, and look at the sample, they'll like to write a paragraph on pathos, a paragraph on ethos, a paragraph on logos. There is no format for this paper per se, but that's one really easy way to structure this paper. But each of these appeals, right, you need to do 3 things with each of these appeals. Okay, so with pathos, you'll find a couple of examples of this from your artifact, and you'll identify these. You'll say, these are some appeals to pathos. Not all of them are apparent. Like, you can't just say, when the person smiles, it's an appeal to pathos. Okay, so identifying it is also explaining why it's an appeal to pathos. You also need to analyze that appeal. So how does that person smiling, right, act as an appeal to pathos? How is it operating with and against the rhetorical situation? So maybe the smiling maybe it's a somber ad that you're looking at. Maybe the smiling adds a ray of light in this ad that you're discussing. And then finally, you'll need to evaluate these examples. So how well do you think they're operating? Okay. And so this is how you build your claims in the paper. So that's the final thing you'll see: claims built through evidence, analysis, and evaluation. So This is really getting at you to write a paper that have these really strong, beefy claims, right? Here are some examples to pathos. Here's how they operate in conjunction with the rhetorical situation. And here's how I see them working, okay? And so your job, you're really going to be evaluated on your ability to both identify, evaluate, and analyze your artifacts' appeals to ethos, pathos, and logos with respect to the rhetorical situation. There is a rubric on our course website under Paper 1 folder, and you can look at the details for specifically how I'm going to grade this paper. Okay, so this is exactly what you're supposed to do for paper number 1. Refer back to this video and this document as you're putting together paper number 1 to make sure that you meet the minimum requirements and what's expected of you in this paper. Thank you.